Our last speaker for this session is Dr. Seth Shankoff. Dr. Shonkoff is the Executive Director of the Energy, Science, and Policy Research Institute, PSE Healthy Energy. He is also a visiting scholar in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at the University of California, Berkeley, and an affiliate at the Environmental Energy Technology area at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. An environmental and public health scientist by training, he has more than 20 years of experience in water, air, climate, and population health research at the Energy Interface and has published more than 50 peer-reviewed journal articles and reports. Dr. Shonkoff is a widely recognized expert on the human health and climate dimensions of oil and gas systems. He has testified before Congress and other decision-making bodies and has led and co-authored multiple high-profile scientific assessments. His work includes the Human Health Chapter of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Fifth Assessment Report, and has legislated evaluations of oil and gas development, hydraulic fracturing, produced water management, and reuse and underground gas storage facilities in the state of California. Dr. Shonkoff sits on a number of science policy expert panels and completed his PhD in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management, and his MPH in epidemiology in the School of Public Health from the University of California, Berkeley. Please welcome Dr. Shonkoff.
Thank you for having me, and thanks to the League of Women Voters for putting this together every year. It's just such a treat. I'm going to be speaking with you all about a systematic review of the literature that my colleagues and I published a couple of months back, looking at the methane and health damaging air pollutants from the oil and gas sector. So just for those that don't know who PSE is, I'll give you a little intro. So we're an Energy, Science, and Policy Research Institute, and we focus on the public health, climate, and environmental dimensions of energy production and use. Okay. So I'd first like to just acknowledge all of the amazing co-authors and colleagues that I have worked with on this study and many others. You can see folks are from PSE, Harvard, South Coast AQMD, and elsewhere. So want to acknowledge those folks. So I want to start by just giving you a flavor of how we approached this systematic review. So we wanted to look at the last 10 years of peer-reviewed literature on methane and health-damaging air pollutants. And really the driver for this is to, there's been a lot of research, as a number of speakers before me have touched upon. There's been a lot of research on methane leakage from the oil and gas sector. And there's also been a lot of research on health-damaging air pollutants across the oil and gas sector. What there hasn't been is a systematic look at how these two things fit together. And we can learn a lot about how to protect public health and the climate by looking at these two literatures in unison. And that's really the driving force here. So again, we reviewed the literature on methane, health-damaging air pollutants, and literature that touched on both. This was really a 3-review-in-1 tour de force across the entire oil and gas sector, ranging from upstream production, midstream transmission, and then downstream end use. And then we broke all of our results out into findings, recommendations, and some research gaps that were left over. So after searching Web of Science and PubMed and other peer-reviewed literature search databases, we came out with about 23,000 candidates for our systematic review. Through our inclusion and exclusion criteria, which you can read about in our report, we boiled it down to 270 total unique studies. As you can see, the majority of the work on methane and health damaging air pollutants on the oil and gas sector is on the upstream environment, so around production and extraction and development of these hydrocarbons, followed by midstream and then finally downstream. And you can see that the majority of the studies have been conducted on methane, followed by health damaging air pollutants, followed by the small minority that have looked at both simultaneously. We found that there was pretty good geographic spread in terms of where these studies have been conducted, perhaps dominated by Western states, Texas, and the Northeast. So I'm going to run through quickly some of our key findings, and then I'm going to get into a few more details as we move through the presentation. So the first key finding is that the composition and magnitude of emissions from oil and gas systems depends on many factors. Number two, oil and gas emissions are nearly always sources of health damaging air pollutants. However, not all sources of health damaging air pollutants across the oil and gas sector are sources of methane. Number three, prioritizing methane reductions near populations can increase the public health and cost benefit of emissions reductions. Super emitters, which others have talked about in this session, exist for both methane and health damaging air pollutants and simultaneously present the greatest challenges and opportunities. And then finally, there's a big literature out there at this point. This is not new, nascent, emerging science. And so the science of methane and health damaging air pollutant emissions, has increased substantially and calls for additional study. Although additional study should continue, it should no longer be a barrier for addressing this issue. We have enough information to get going. So here's the details on the key findings from our report. So emissions vary by many factors, including the type of hydrocarbon, where we are in the supply chain, the source, emission controls that are applied, et cetera. And there's two main types of health damaging and climate forcing emissions from oil and gas systems. One is fugitive gas emissions. So these are leaks and intentional venting of non-combusted gases that emit relatively high proportions of methane and associated volatile organic compounds, or non-methane VOCs, many of which are health damaging in and of themselves. And the second source type is combustion emissions. So these would be, say, diesel engines or lit flares, where you're going to get less methane because a lot of it's been broken down into CO2 and water, and possibly fewer VOCs, but higher levels of criteria air pollutants such as nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, and particulate matter, among others. And so the greatest opportunity to co-reduce, meaning reduce at the same time, methane and health damaging air pollutants, is by targeting fugitive or vented emissions of natural gas at any point in the oil and gas supply chain. And we were able, through the review of this literature, to really get deep into the four most effective methane and health damaging air pollution controls that can be deployed immediately. That would deal, again, with methane and health damaging air pollutants simultaneously. So this is tankless designs and additional vapor control measures on liquid storage tanks and dehydrators, replacement and repair of existing pneumatic devices with zero bleed devices, electrification of compressor stations, and preventing the need for flaring through additional separators or vapor recovery units, basically building out that gas gathering infrastructure. And importantly, also, there's what we termed an emerging consensus in the literature that liquid storage tanks are the single largest fugitive emission source for both methane and VOCs, and that these emissions are disproportionately underestimated in inventories. So in terms of policy options and what needs to be done absolutely now, this slide really, I think, captures the majority of that. So moving on to key finding number 2, oil and gas emissions are nearly always sources of health-damaging air pollutants. However, not all sources of health-damaging air pollutants are sources of methane. This is a really important point. So, when we think about how we know what we know, oftentimes it comes down to how we go about monitoring for things in the environment. And a lot of monitoring has focused on methane, and methane has been chosen as somewhat of a surrogate for these other compounds that are entrained in natural gas. However, things like condensate tanks are not methane rich. There's not a lot of methane in them, but there's a lot of non-methane VOCs and health damaging air pollutants. So a linear focus on methane will systematically underestimate potential air quality and human health issues across the oil and gas supply chain, but in particular in the upstream, where you have these non-methane rich sources. Number 3, prioritize methane reductions near populations can increase the public health and cost benefit of emission reductions. So it's important to state that methane is globally mixed. It actually doesn't really matter where methane is emitted when it pertains to climate, but it actually matters a lot where methane, and it's really not methane, it's natural gas, which is a cocktail, which is predominantly methane, but not only methane. It really does matter geographically speaking where the emissions happen. It's much different to have a gas leak in the middle of a desert where there aren't people around than right in downtown Los Angeles. Aliso Canyon, the last speaker spoke about the Aliso Canyon well blowout. That's a great example of where a methane emission event can have a bigger population health impact in the middle of Los Angeles than, again, further afield. And a pretty understudied methane leakage point is where there could be some exposures to associated non-methane volatile organic compounds and health damaging air pollutants is right there in your kitchen. Gas stoves, there's some emerging literature that gas stoves, even on steady state off, is leaking natural gas. And this is something that we've called out as needing to have a closer look at. Super emitters exist for both methane and health damaging air pollutants and simultaneously present the greatest challenge and opportunity. So we found that super emitters, and wasn't what we found. The entire body of literature has found that super emitters are present in all parts of the supply chain and exist for both methane and health damaging air pollutants. As has been talked about time and time again, these super emitter sources are great opportunities because they're fairly easily fixable. And if you fix them, you fix a good proportion of the problem. But we should also keep in mind that we shouldn't only focus on super emitters when we're trying to maximize and optimize on public health and reduce exposures to chemicals that are associated with natural gas. Because place matters for health. It matters if a super emitter event is taking place far away from where people live, work, and play. That might actually hold fewer health consequences than a smaller leak event that's happening in the middle of somebody's kitchen or on a distribution or transmission pipeline that's going through a major city. And finally, I'll end again with this determination that we arrived at, that over the past decade, over the past 10 years, the science on oil and gas emissions has really increased substantially. 10 years ago, there were only a couple handfuls of studies, and now there's more than 270. And so calls for additional study should no longer be barriers for action. And this is really, where the literature is right now. There's actually a really enormous body. There's been researchers have looked at this from a lot of different directions, from top down to bottom up through modeling. And we have a very clear understanding of what needs to happen in terms of controlling these emissions and moving away from oil and gas in a managed transition. So I'd also like to acknowledge the reviewers of this report, Jonathan Buoncore from Harvard and Evan Sherwin from Stanford. And I encourage all of you to hop onto our website and take a look at this review. Thanks so much for taking the time. Looking forward to questions.